All right, here we are for part 2 of topic 5, video support that is. Notice that the playlist that you are watching here is available on the active outline for online learning. It's a smaller link than is ideal, but it's right there. Also linked is, of course, the set of notes for topic 5 that we're going to be addressing here. I recommend you have those open in a separate window in case we have video quality issues. All right, let's move quickly through 5.2, microeconomic perspective on slavery and the African American experience. Not nearly as much of the historical nuance and interesting stuff as is available, but we're just going to hit the 310 points. All right, so we start with the point that in 1966 it was Ingerman who discovered the finding that we've been highlighting, which is that the South was not as poor as everyone had expected. The South having about $100 of per capita income in the U.S. as a whole, having 128. Now, because no one had done anything like this and everyone was thinking of the 20th century South and how morally bad slavery was, Ingerman was very surprised to find that the South was not as poor as he had expected to find. So he and his co-author Robert Fogel went to work, and they gathered all sorts of data to calculate the productivity of southern agriculture in comparison to northern agriculture. And the punchline you need to be aware of is simply that the productivity comparison revealed that southern agricultural productivity was substantially greater than northern agricultural productivity. The results they came up with suggest that the same land, labor, and resources organized as a farm or plantation in the South would produce 40% more output than would those resources if they were organized in a farm in the North. Now, some people suggested it was just southern climate that was at work and the ability to grow cotton, the lucrative crop of the time. Maybe it's like sugar was back in the 17th and 18th centuries. But in any case, the next step for analysis was for Fogel and Ingerman to look within the South. They looked within the South, organizing evidence on production units, farms or plantations of different sizes. And they categorized the farming operations into 4 categories: those that had no slaves being used on them, those where 1 to 15 slaves were being used, 16 to 50, and 51. And the key point for our purposes is to recognize that all of the slave-using farms in the South come out with measured productivity greater than the non-slave-using farms, the farms that did not use farms. Let's call those the free farms. So slave-based farming was more productive than free labor farming. That dispensed with the notion that it was simply southern climate that made southern farms more productive than northern farms, because looking within the South, it's the slave-based farming that is more productive. My PhD dissertation and my first or second article looked at the case of Virginia and found that those that were producing wheat and tobacco in Virginia exhibited a similar pattern, although less dramatically so. Anyhow, for those of you interested, be alert for 2 possible explanations for the greater measured productivity of the plantations. One, the view that I've pushed in my work, is that the plantations were rather like factories in the field, organized on this notion of gang labor, people working in groups driven to work harder, with the groups being coordinated with each other and the people within the groups being coordinated. So division of labor and almost assembly line techniques. Now, not everyone buys this view. Some people say, no, no, no. It's just that slaves had to work longer days than free people, and that in any group of people, more of the slaves would be put to work. Most notably, women would be forced to work at agricultural production much more than free people would have chosen. Most notably, the notion that they were forced to reduce their household production, including their child-rearing activities. Now, in that, there's all sorts of fascinating discussion and possibilities, because there is some evidence to suggest that the plantations had high rates of labor force mobilization, and the larger plantations, for example, had something like a daycare center where the very old slaves who could no longer do field work were quite busy taking care of the children so that the moms could be in the fields producing. Some bizarre parallels to early 21st century America. In either case, don't get too worried about the debates over why slave agriculture was more productive than free, more productive in generating income that the masters took, by the way. Let's not get romantic about this. But in either case, the point we find is that our current understanding is that slavery boosted production compared to free labor. So in a huge reversal of the way people used to think about the problem of slavery in America, now we're thinking the problem of slavery was not too little production, but rather too much. And with that view, suddenly the 1860s makes sense. The decline of Southern per capita GDP occurred when the slaves were emancipated, when they were freed from being forced to work like slaves, and they could adopt and adapt more typical free people's work routines and household production routines. All right, turning then to more of an historical focus, we want to think about what the economics suggests for us about what life was like for the enslaved people. And in relation to that, just some notion of how did this system work? Well, we're not going to cover the full range of debates and discussions and possibilities. We're not even going to hint at them. Instead, let's just point out the punchlines that we know from economic history research. Whatever we make of the material conditions of slave life, we want to recognize that they are conditions that sustained hard work, a growing population, and political stability. So the point simply is that the slaves were working very hard and they were producing lots of output. Moreover, they were reproducing much like the white population. This, I hope, reminds you of our findings on New World demography in the colonial era, where the unique and interesting feature of slavery in the U.S. was the relatively high rates of population growth in contrast to the sugar areas, which were death traps and where the populations did not grow. Anyhow, having population growth rates similar between the enslaved black and the free white populations has something to say about whether the basic material conditions of life were being taken care of. Anyhow, the point for our purposes, political stability in the United States slave system. All right, the interesting point to note is that political stability was there in the U.S. slave system. There were a series of interesting different attempts by different enslaved people to lead rebellions. But notice that once the Civil War started, when Union troops were in the proximity, the enslaved people moved quickly to join the Union troops and to basically overthrow slavery from within, because once Union troops were there and the forces of government were no longer supporting the institution of slavery, the slaves exhibited their agency. They acted. and were critical to the destruction of slavery on the ground, and indeed to the success of the Union war effort. Anyhow, the usual way we used to conclude the discussion of the microeconomics of slavery was to say that the economists like Fogel and Ingerman and later ones showed that the southern slave people produced a lot, leaving lots of debate on how and why they produced a lot. But that did eliminate the old discussions that saw plantations as chaotic and violent prisons with starving inmates. It eliminated former comparisons between the plantations and the concentration camps of Nazi Germany. Instead, the economic history picture that emerges is these were people who were doing lots of work, fueled by lots of food. Then the historians, early on in the, especially starting in the 1960s, Blassingham, for example, and Genovese, just to name two, showed that, or reminded, we might say, that the slaves were people and they were not passive victims. And historians focused attention on the agency of African Americans under slavery and the space that they were able to create for themselves within an institution called slavery. And that in turn eliminated a discussion of how masters treated the slaves. We can't understand the slaves like we might understand the cattle or the swine. That would be to adopt the southern slaveholders' perspective, the pretense, we might say. And historians think and explore instead how slaves carved out space for their own families and their communities. Discussions here of the importance of religion and faith to the African American communities. Interesting discussions too of carryovers from African cultures and the early African American distinctive cultural forms. For the economists, there's debate also over the notion of incentives, specifically the question of whether there were positive incentives if the people worked hard, getting Saturday off, getting cash awards perhaps, or perhaps negative incentives. To what extent were people working because the threat of violent correction, whipping, and other forms of abuse were lurking in the background? No doubt that force underpinned the entire system, but there still remains the question of the nature and extent to which force was being used. And there's more generally debate on the extent to which slaves as individuals or as groups were able to transcend and rise above and make more of their lives than we might expect from the situation. And finally, in conclusion, economists and historians reminded everyone that the U.S. offers important contrasts to the sugar areas, the West Indies and Brazil, where there was much worse demographic experiences and where the economies in the long run ended up much poorer. And that used to be the end of our discussion of the microeconomics of slavery until the mid-1980s. Okay, so one last point to cover is simply that Richard Steckel, to whom you were introduced in the first part of the course with the economic history encyclopedia article on the standard of living and all the discussion of heights and so on. Anyhow, some of Richard Steckel's early work revolves around the notion that slave life involved a dreadful childhood. I direct you to his work for a broader discussion here. Let's just note the simple point. Steckel's argument is that slave infants and slave children had a dreadful childhood. And in fact, his argument suggests that that dreadful childhood extended backward even into in utero when the children, before the children were born. In his view, those conditions were as bad as the worst urban slums of India or Brazil in the late 20th century, which is pretty horrible conditions. And notice a stark contrast to the conditions that we understand to have been the case on the plantations for the adults. So anyhow, there's this fairly tenuous set of measurements and assumptions from which Steckel pitches his argument that the slave children were experiencing a dreadful childhood. And he conjectures that the mothers were overworked, the children were underfed, and as I said, that material conditions were as bad as the worst urban slums of the late 21st century. Now, there's two ways to go with this. One is to accept Steckel's characterization, say, okay, the U.S. slaves were a peculiar population with tiny kids, miserably growing in a miserable environment, but tall adults who had caught up in growth. And the whole notion that there might be such catch-up growth is one that remains controversial and to be debated. Point for our purposes simply is, if we accept Steckel's characterization, if Steckel is right, then we've got a rather different perspective on slave life compared to what we thought before Steckel's work. Steckel's telling us awful conditions for kids, and then once they escape childhood and become working slaves, suddenly they get lots of food and material conditions of life are okay. If so, we're being given a picture of the slave community in which the enslaved were powerless to protect their children. I think that sounds awful. It has all sorts of implications for how slavery worked as a system and how much slaves were able to overcome the problems of the system and make meaning in their lives. We see perhaps the legacy of slavery in the persistent poverty in places like Alabama and Mississippi, and the legacies of slavery in the racial inequities economically and socially in Michigan and throughout the country. But that really is looking too far beyond what you need to worry about for topic 5. I hope you'll find some stuff here in this topic to inspire you to learn more and some of you to teach more in the future. But I got to wrap it up now and wish you good luck with Tuesday's test. Goodbye and good health.